Hi. I have to address this immediately because I've heard that all morning. Who is that? I did shave. Apparently my son doesn't love me anymore, but it's okay. Hey, I wanna bring you back to circa 2010, and my taste in music found its all-time peak. And that fact actually remains the same today, in which the genre of music that is most precious to me and moves me still is referred to as, listen, post-hardcore / emo music. And if you don't know what I just said, I do have a playlist for you, but I also am very bummed out that you don't know the glory of this. But just imagine your soul serenading in screams of angsty teens and 20-somethings, combined with nasally high-pitched singing, often out of key. And if these bands threw in some brilliant halftime big drum breakdown with huge guitar riffs, you felt as if born again, baptized by the breakdown. But I actually joined a band kind of like this, an emo / pop punk, whatever you want to call it. And I would share stages with bands similar to like what I described. And from behind the drums, I would look out and see good friends performing the songs that we wrote together, headbanging, doing all this stuff. It was super fun. We did a 2-month tour across the United States. Gosh. Yeah. And we found ourselves in Kansas City. Oh, all right. And this was the type of tour in which you ended the tour with less money than you started. But you did get to experience the glamour of what it is to sleep in a van with 5 other dudes in Walmart parking lots across the US. So you got to view and tour all these places across the US. But one of these late nights after a show, it was like 1 a.m. in the morning, that's just how it goes in tour life. We were invited in Kansas City to go to a place called IHOP. And I know you're thinking I didn't know that they had pancakes that late or early in the day. But this isn't a place of pancakes. IHOP stands for International House of Prayer. This is a building that hosts 24/7 worship through song and prayer. And so we were invited this, again, at 1 a.m. in the morning. And so I thought 1 a.m. in the morning, there's certainly gonna be only a limited amount of people there. But we show up and it's a packed house. It is a packed house. A full worship team leading prayer rooms to be prayed over, pray privately, among other things to do. And it was an amazing experience. And I remember vividly thinking about how it used to just destroy my mind to try to think about and conceptualize a heaven in which I'm gonna be singing for all of eternity 24/7. And lo and behold, it's a real place, y'all. And so we arrived close to 1 a.m. It was packed. And what impacted me the most was that the atmosphere was filled with expectancy, passion, and emotion. It was like tactile in the air. And as I was thinking about the text and the context that we have before us this morning about this traveling caravan of the people of God who were not only giving praise on their way to a place, but they're planning their praise for when they arrive to the place. They were making specific arrangements on not just what are we gonna do, what are the first thing on our to-do list. For them, the first thing on their to-do list was to arrive and give praise. So I'm excited to share my heart this morning on worship and praise, and I think it seems fitting given my passions and what I get to do every Sunday. And today brings our series, Ascend, to an end. And I really hope that as we arrive to this end, that we would be pointed to and pointed to and directed towards a new beginning of becoming, and more specifically, as Bill mentioned, becoming people of praise. But people of praise who can praise amidst adversity and even amidst complexity. And so let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Psalm 134. This is the final book or final of the series, but this is also the final psalm of the Psalm of Ascent. Go ahead and put a bookmark there. And throughout the series, Bill has mentioned the utility and the beautiful way these psalms were to be used by the ancient Hebrew people who would often find themselves on a pilgrimage, on a journey. And these psalms are sometimes referred to as the songs for going up. And I remember early on in this series, Bill talked about and used the image of a Spotify playlist. And even thinking for us, some of you may have gone from your front door into your car to put on a worship playlist just on your travel to worship, to do more worship. And I love that if that's you. And I think that's not a bad idea. It almost serves as like a warm-up. Because see, oftentimes we arrive at church hoping for a spark of something, a feeling or an aha moment. And what we see from the ancient wisdom of the Hebrew people is an invitation for us to enter into a discipline of praise. And so this psalm is now what they would sing as they are no longer on the road. They have made it to their destination. They are now in the long-awaited sanctuary. And for us, through the Spirit, we know as Christians, we see ourselves as the living sanctuaries in which God dwells. But at the same time, I still think it's a nice parallel that you got in a car, you drove here, perhaps even caravaned, and traveled to sanctuary/worship center, whatever you want to call it. But let's do this. Let's read the passage together. Only 3 verses. And it says this: "Praise the Lord, all you servants of the Lord who minister by night in the house of the Lord. Lift up your hands in the sanctuary and praise the Lord. May the Lord bless you from Zion, he who is the maker of heaven and earth." So here's where I'd like to draw our attention towards this morning, and it's to frame our time with this big idea. Praising God is the destination. Praising God is the destination. Becoming a person of praise is who we're meant to be and how we're meant to posture our lives. And worship is where we are to be headed towards. And in my years of being, becoming, and identifying as a Christian, I've come to understand that praising God, despite of and through the long and difficult times, produces a depth and even a nuance to our praise and worship. And there is a tension in this topic that exists. There is a tension, and for many of us perhaps even. And I think this tension exists due to our tendency to rather quickly rescue ourselves from what we perceive as negative emotions. But more specifically in relation to us Christians, the tension of feeling even guilty or ashamed that we are not a building of 24/7 praise and joy. We don't feel happy 24/7. And there is certainly a cultural tension that I see of 2 major binary categories, and there could be more, I'm sure. But what I want us to look at today is these 2 topics of toxic positivity and toxic authenticity. So let's look at toxic positivity. And this can often come cloaked in a lot of truth statements. But often they are half-truths. And remember, if we're not careful, half-truths can be harmful. Toxic positivity, or something some people refer to as spiritual bypassing, can show up in certain phrases such as this: God's got this. Friend, just have faith over fear and let go and let God and give it to the Lord. Are these bad? Are these untrue? No, these are actually really beautiful and part of our rich tradition of our faith and things we look to. So they're not bad, but it's the context in which we may throw them into, which might show up in a moment that we find uncomfortable. And so we try to suppress the inward conflict that we may be experiencing. And we may think we're supposed to be feeling a certain thing in a certain moment, or even if someone is before us, we try to throw that at them to rescue them as well. As some of us may be aware of the wisdom in dance in which we do not seek to allow our feelings to dictate nor direct our paths and pursuits. We don't want to do this. We don't want to minimize our humanity to the point in which we begin detaching ourselves from the signposts in which our emotions are. This God-given piece of our humanity that, if wielded well, can be one of our greatest allies towards deep relationship, deep relationality. And in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Pete Scazzaro, he wrote this: ignoring our emotions is turning our back on reality. Listening to our emotions ushers us into reality. And reality is where we meet God. Emotions are the language of the soul. They are the cry that gives the heart a voice. I love that. Gives the heart a voice. See, on the opposite end of that toxic positivity, there's a movement that I think is incredibly attractive. And it promises zero compromise and alignment within the self, inner peace. And what I'm speaking of is something called toxic authenticity. And for a silly example for us, an obvious way this can show up would be if I said to my wife, "Hun, studies have shown that living an authentic life improves my well-being and has shown to minimize stress and exhaustion. Therefore, I have decided, in order to be authentic, my love, I will not be doing the dishes this week, nor will I be helping putting our kids to sleep every night this week." That would be obviously ridiculous of me, and I deserve a kick in the shin. Authenticity cannot mean that we get to just forgo certain responsibilities, right? And so we must ask this: where is that fine line between harmful and helpful authenticity? Where is that fine line? Because see, even harmful versions of this can find its way into even a disciple's life, and it will infiltrate our decision process in which we decide whether or not it's good or not to engage with God in spiritual practices. See, one could say, my authentic self does not want to read or pray or interact with God at all, and I have to be true to that. For if I do the thing that I don't want to do, I will create what's called cognitive dissonance, disalignment within me, and that will be really, really bad. The temptation here could be to interpret what I'm saying is a message of do better, try harder, and just push through. And I'm not entirely just suggesting that. May I suggest that being vulnerable with where our hearts are in trying to remove the facades and even expressing thoughts and emotions might better define true authenticity. And then you may say, with a very necessary comeback, well, I tried that, and my vulnerabilities and thoughts have been interpreted and are being interpreted as I am just being unloyal and I'm being too emotional. There is no space for me. And I want to say I hear that. And I hate that that is your experience. For I know all too well the reality of religious trauma, church hurt, and adverse religious experiences. What I'm trying to do carefully and with sensitivity is to offer us caution before we make ourselves the sole arbiter, the sole decider of what we think is best for and what we think brings most meaning, purpose, and beauty to this life. And so I have to say that I come to you as an advocate for those who are struggling with these type of hurts and who even find it painful to praise. I stand with you in solidarity as one who has shared in that pain as well. And I wanna offer something that is hopefully thoughtful for all of us. And that's whether you're experiencing doubt, truly cognitive dissonance, a faith shift complexity, or even in the beauty of certainty. Wherever you find yourself on this gradient of faith, one of the most helpful things that I've learned on my pilgrimage is that there is freedom to praise. Freedom to praise is found when God's character is in focus. When God's character is in focus. Because see, I believe that authentic worship is accessible in both despair and delight when God's portrait is portrayed well. So I ask you, what is your God like? And seriously, think about it. What is your God like? And even what would you hope God is like? And that may sound scary for some of us. We may have a reflex to say, I can't do that because a great tradition, beautiful great tradition and beautiful orthodoxy has said, I can't do that. I'm not asking you to undermine anything that you were handed. What I'm asking for you to do is notice, is there any clash within you that tries to envision of God you were presented and a God that you have hoped for? In his book, God Has a Name, John Mark Comer wrote this. He said, in the modern world, we start with the assumption that we know what God is like, and then we judge every religion or church or sermon based on our view of God. I've had many conversations over the last 10 years of leading worship with the brave souls who have told me, Mitch, praise is very painful. That even entering into a building to worship feels like terror. And you know what I often most hear is the reason is, why did God do that? Why is God doing this? And just a side note, if a few brave souls are willing enough to admit to their worship pastor that an activity that is seemingly imperative to the Christian life is not yielding positive results, then I would imagine that there's more of you that exist. See, there often comes a point in which our expectation of a good God who loves us by seeking our well-being clashes head-on with tragedy and theology. And for some reason, our reflex is to credit God with full authorship. But see, the ancient Hebrews wrestled with big questions like this, as well as in the Psalms where we've been. God, where are you? God, why are you doing this? These are all cries found in the book we hold precious as our sacred text. And so the question is, how did they stay in the faith? How do we stay in the faith and even praise amidst adversity and complexity? And I want to suggest what's beautiful on this side of the cross. I want to suggest that when you think of God's character, think of Jesus. When you think of God's character, think of Jesus. It almost sounds too simple. I know, but when was the last time that you were reminded that the God on the cross was the image of the invisible God? That the face of Jesus is the one in whom we look to, and what the Bible says is the full revelation of God. In Colossians, it says this. It says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created. Things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, or rulers or powers, all things have been created through and for him. And one pastor and theologian said it this way. He said, to look at Jesus, especially on the cross, says 1 John, is to behold the clearest depiction of the God who is love. And he continued and said this, I've come to believe that Jesus alone is perfect theology. And if I could be authentic before you, as a fellow faithful believer in process, before you, my faith family, I'd like to share very briefly my struggle that took place some time ago. I had experienced the deepest spiritual pain in my life. And I think the biggest tragedy is that almost no one would have known of it. There were days in which I would try to read the Bible and I would physically shake as I would try to read. I would drive away from church services after leading worship, feeling sick to my stomach, and my heart would begin to race. I was experiencing what many have called the dark night of the soul, a time in which seeks to try to describe this phenomenon when it seems as if God is either absent or that God is not real. And some of faith's hardest questions came flooding into my mind, and here I was trying to lead others into the presence of a God I no longer thought I knew. Talk about imposter syndrome and the havoc that could do to one's nervous system. And when I thought I had the answer was to quit my ministry and be a barista, I literally thought that sounds so nice, I thought, for a season. But I was advised by a good friend to spend some time in the Gospels if you can, looking closely at the life of Jesus, and so I did. I also did the most reading in my life I ever had, theology books, books about the character of God, the nature of the Bible, the nature of Christ, and which is called Christology, and all these things that other theology nerds would get giddy over. Here's the point I'm trying to make, that if your heart is breaking and you're caught up in the complexities of life, perhaps honest questioning, grieving a loss, filled with anxiety, I could keep going. I want to invite you to picture our God on the cross. Picture the face of Jesus. And if you would humor me for just a moment, I'm gonna ask us to close our eyes to try to do that, if you're comfortable. But if you would close your eyes, I want you to picture Christ as you do, and that could be brown or blue eyes. Don't worry about that right now. And imagine being within arm's reach of him. It's a quiet environment as it is now. He is looking into your eyes and has been listening to you pour out your heart from its depths. And you finish your last sentence, and as you do, your eyes now retreat to the floor, and it goes even more quiet. And it seems to remain silent for an eternity. But now imagine hearing Jesus say, as your eyes are closed and in your mind, your eyes are to the floor, you hear him say, breathe. I will be with you through this. Your eyes retreat from the floor just in enough time to hear him say, you are not alone, my son or daughter. And in that moment, the worry, the stress, anxiety, complexity, all these things falls away. And it's not because he promised to take it away in one miraculous sweeping moment, but because he simply said, you're not alone. Now you could open your eyes. I want you to consider the emotions that Jesus conveyed throughout the Gospels for those who were suffering and in turmoil. And why wouldn't he offer that same heart to you, a heart that is patient? Verse 2 of our passage this morning, it says, lift up your hands in the sanctuary of praise. Lift up your hands. And we don't have the time to do like a deep dive into the vast traditions of the way Israelites and Christians throughout the centuries have attempted to embody their praise and postures. But we should at least notice that there is wisdom here, that often we may need to lead with posture when desire is not present. Lead with posture when desire is not present. But what are we even doing when we do this? What are we tapping into? For many of us, we have been rewired from childhood to not to look like something, be very still. So I understand there's a complexity there. But I'm convinced that this is just not a mere Christian phenomenon to lift your hands. And even studies have shown that the body's posture not only is something that expresses what's happening inwardly, but that it could be wielded to indicate to your heart and mind something that you know to be true and beautiful. It could deepen the impression of a moment. And one way of thinking about this as well, an intern, Jenna, she helped me think through this. And I love how she said it. She said, it's possible that as Christians, we want to embody our praise to make a more hospitable space to interact with the Spirit. Sometimes we need to embody our praise to make a more hospitable space to interact with the Spirit. And now you might be thinking, sounds nice, but I don't have any more in me. My worship life is dry, and there's literally no praise within. I want to draw you to something Jesus noticed, because Jesus gives a beautiful example for us to consider when it comes to this, and it's found in Mark, and you don't need to turn there. In Mark 12:41, Jesus makes this contrast between how the Jewish leaders of the day conducted themselves compared to that of a widow. In that passage, it says this: Jesus sat down opposite of the place where the offerings were put, and he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Did you know that before we continue, that these offering basket type things were like trumpet shaped and made noise when you dropped your offering in. Isn't that kind of weird? So imagine Jesus is witnessing and rich people are coming in and you hear, and they go, yeah. And then the next person in line, also rich, everyone could hear the sound and the echo of how much they gave. And then a widow comes up and you hear dink, dink. And Jesus then calling his disciples, he says, hey, come here. Jesus said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had to live on. Maybe like this widow, you don't have much left. And maybe all you have left to give is simply just showing up. And that could be you today. And that's okay. I'm not suggesting you be loud and rowdy just to somehow make God notice you or make the worship pastor feel good about their job. My truest hope and desire is for you to bring the little or the much that you have in your heart. And when you lift your hands, you are seeing Jesus's face. Because sometimes the best we can do is show up. And I'd like to think that showing up can be enough worship in a season. So if praise is not only what we aim to do on our journey, but is where we are trying to cultivate our life to arrive to, the question I want to ask us in reflection is praise your destination? Is praise your destination? Given your life patterns, rhythms, and choices, what are you aiming towards? What type of arrival point are these things creating for you? And as we close the passage today, it ends beautifully. It ends with referring to God as the maker of heaven and earth. And what's beautiful about our Christian faith is that we not only believe that this great God who breathed on matter to become what it has, also God's self became matter as well. Became flesh, blood, and bone to portray the heart of God. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection reveals to us exactly who it is that we worship and what God is like. So we're gonna close with a time of communion and reflecting on Jesus. That's my invitation. And to also reflect on the joy he has over you. Take that moment to reflect on the one in whom we call King, who conquered the sting of death. And listen, who forever reserves a seat for you at his table. And also notice that this table is larger than we can imagine. We don't only share a seat next to a cross from our chosen favorite people. We sit next to the broken. We sit next to the misunderstood, the doubter, and more. We do this together as a people far and wide to partake in remembering our royal identities and the length God would go to communicate that. So when you're ready, partake of the bread that is the body, of the juice that is the blood of a king. And then the band is going to close our time in the worshiping of King Jesus. So go ahead and take that moment now.